Here's a nice way of getting at the mind-body problem. Consider this styrofoam teacup. If you're like most people, probably think it is simply an arrangement of matter and energy, or it's matter arranged in a certain way with some energy in it, or something like that. Now, consider the difference between this teacup and my mind. It's not a difference in the degree of complexity of matter and energy. This is not conscious, and in fact it has nothing to do with consciousness or sentience. The difference between the cup and the mind is not a difference in the degree of complexity of the arrangement of matter and energy of the cup. You don't make this thing into a mind just by making it more complex. Now consider the difference between the cup and your computer or your phone or whatever device you're watching this video on. The difference between the cup and the computer is a difference in degree of complexity. The computer also is an arrangement of matter and energy, only it's more complex. Now, what does this mean? If you're like many people, probably most people these days, you think the difference between the computer and the mind is a difference in degree of complexity, because you think the mind is the brain, and the difference between the brain and the computer is a difference in degree of complexity. Well, you can't have it both ways. The difference between the mind and the cup is not a difference in degree of complexity. The difference between cup and brain is a difference in degree of complexity. Therefore, the mind is not the brain. That's the Cartesian way. Now, there's an alternative here. The materialist alternative is to revise that initial assessment and say the difference between the cup and the mind is a difference in degree of complexity. This does have something to do with consciousness. The only reason this is not a consciousness is that it's not sufficiently complex. Now, there's an alternative here, of course, to the Cartesian way. In addition to this materialist alternative, there is the hylomorphist way. The hylomorphist is free to accept the Cartesian argument, but only as a hypothetical. Now let's review that argument one more time and then emphasize what I mean when I say as a hypothetical. We start with the everyday presumption that this is an arrangement of matter and energy, and the natural perception that the difference between this and my mind is not a difference in degree of complexity. This is not conscious. And the reason it's not conscious is not that it's insufficiently complex. The reason is it has nothing to do with consciousness. But the difference between this and the brain is a difference in degree of complexity, therefore the mind is not the brain. That's the Cartesian argument. Now, the hylomorphist is free to take the Cartesian argument, but consider it merely as a hypothetical. That is to say, the hylomorphist says, if this is an arrangement of matter and energy and that alone, and if the brain is only an arrangement of matter and energy, then the brain is not the mind. Then matter has nothing to do with consciousness. But the hylomorphist is free to say this is not only an arrangement of matter and energy. It has non-physical component. Review if you need to, or study for the first time if necessary, hylomorphism. There is a playlist on this channel called What Are Things? In this playlist, Phil and Sophie will introduce hylomorphism. I recommend viewing that. So the hylomorphist now can say this is not an arrangement of matter and energy alone. Yes, it is that, but it's more than that. There's also a non-physical, immaterial essence or nature to the cup. And there also is a non-physical, immaterial component to the brain. And the hylomorphist can say matter does not produce consciousness and accept Descartes' argument for this. But the hylomorphist is also free to say that the mind is the brain, and pure matter does not produce consciousness, but the brain is not pure matter. It's not just an arrangement of matter and energy. It has a non-physical component. And the physical and the non-physical combine to make the teacup, and the physical and the non-physical combine to make the brain, which is the mind. Matter alone does not produce consciousness, and the brain is not matter alone. That's a hylomorphist approach that is available. So, to review and summarize, the ordinary way of thinking is that this is an arrangement of matter and energy, and that the difference between it and my mind is not a difference in degree of complexity, but that the difference between this and my brain is a difference in the degree of complexity of the arrangement of matter and energy. And the ordinary way of thinking is that the mind is the brain, and this cannot be. Some principle has to change. The materialist changes the initial assessment that the difference between this and the mind is not a difference in degree of complexity. The materialist says it is a difference in degree of complexity. The Cartesian says, well, the mind is not the brain. That's all there is to it. And the hylomorphist reconsiders the nature of all these things and says, well, it's not merely an arrangement of matter and energy. It has a non-physical component. And so does the brain. And the difference between the mind and the cup is not so much a difference in degree of complexity, though that is a relevant difference, but the major difference between the mind and the cup is the difference in the nature of the non-physical components of both. The non-physical component of this gives this thing the structure and nature and function and order appropriate to a teacup. It's organized as a teacup. Its matter is organized into a teacup. That's all. But the immaterial component of the mind, or the immaterial component that is the mind, or the immaterial component of the brain, which is the mind, has the function of making a thinking thing. And so it's the immaterial component that makes the major difference. Though there is, of course, the difference in degree of complexity as well.